Week 8, Overview. In the Wilderness, Worshiping God as God. I was basically a Jesus freak back in my college days, and I used to debate religion with my friends who grew up going to Sunday school. I still remember an Episcopalian brother who said to me, "It's okay. You worship your God in your way, I'll worship him in his." This week we're going to take a good hard look at what God says about the proper way to worship him. Our take-home message for the week is that we should worship a holy God in a holy way. We've already covered Genesis and Exodus since we began exploring God's tapestry of grace. This week we'll survey Leviticus. In the process, we'll zero in on several Jewish holidays, especially the two major holidays, Rosh Hashanah, New Year, and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. God used the whole system of animal sacrifices to teach the Israelites about His holiness and the sin that separates us from His. Our overarching theme is learning how to worship God as God. In Leviticus, God taught the Israelites that sin had consequences. Their unclean acts offended a holy God, giving them guilty consciences that needed reconciliation. Reconciliation was not cheap. It was messy, bloody, and deadly for the animal sacrificed in the place of guilty people. The violent realities of animal sacrifice illustrated to the Israelites that sin was serious and that they constantly fell short of God's standards. As we learn in the New Testament, Jesus Christ became the ultimate sacrifice, the one who died once for all, removing all need for the animal sacrifices outlined in Leviticus. But those laws were in place for many centuries, acting as both a means of atonement and a schoolteacher to bring us to Christ, as it says in Galatians 3. We'll continue learning about Jewish festivals and holy days, too. We've already looked at the Passover in historical context in Week 3. Your wife may have plans for a traditional Passover meal, called a Seder meal, for the end of the unit. Passover isn't the only major festival in the Jewish calendar, though. This week we'll study the solemn holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. These two feasts fall in September or October, depending on the cycles of the moon. What's the weather like in Israel at that time of year? In general, Israel has hot, dry summers and cool, mild winters. The sun shines pretty much all the time from May through mid-October. In the spring and fall, a hot, dry, dusty wind blows in off the deserts to the east. Most of Israel's rain falls between November and March, especially in December. So these two major festivals come after the worst heat of the summer and before the winter rains set in. It's a good time to celebrate the changing of the year. Rosh Hashanah is the New Year celebration. The Hebrew words mean head of the year. In a lot of cultures, New Year's is a day for celebrating, but it's a solemn religious festival in the Old Testament. They pray for God's forgiveness, for a good year, for long life. The New Year is celebrated on the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishri, which begins in September or October. Today, Jews attend their synagogues on Rosh Hashanah. They blow the ram's horn, called a shofar, just as it says in Leviticus 23, to call the people to worship. 10 days after Rosh Hashanah comes Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. This is the most important and sacred Jewish holy day. It lasts from sunset on the 9th day of Tishri until 3 stars can be seen in the sky on the evening of the 10th day. Yom Kippur is a day for fasting and worship. Until the Jewish temple was destroyed by Rome in AD 70, the high priest entered the holy place in the temple in Jerusalem. Animals were sacrificed, according to the laws in Leviticus. One of the Yom Kippur rituals in Leviticus 6 involved the scapegoat. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest took 2 goats. He sacrificed one, but he laid his hands on the other and confessed the sins of the people over it. Then he let it go out into the desert. This escaped goat, the scapegoat, symbolized how God had taken our sins away. People still use the term scapegoat to refer to somebody who's blamed for someone else's sins. Your older students may be able to see how the ritual of the scapegoat points ahead to Jesus. It takes 2 goats to show what he has done. He died to pay the penalty of our sin, like the first goat, yet he lives and takes our sins as far away from us as east is from the west, like the escaped goat. The fundamental theme of Leviticus is holiness. The question the book asks is, how can a sinful people approach a holy God? If that's a question that fascinates you, then Leviticus is a fascinating book. If you could care less about that question, Leviticus seems dry, boring, and irrelevant. This week's discussion outline for older student walks through questions of sin and holiness. Our outline starts by looking at the conscience, which provides us with a sense of right and wrong. Leviticus doesn't leave something as important as holiness up to something as subjective as our conscience, though. God's law gives us an objective standard to measure our behavior against. God determines how He is to be served, and He spells out how He should be worshipped. Many people nowadays say they worship God in their own way. Does that satisfy a holy God? In Leviticus 10, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, tried to worship God in their own way, but they were struck dead for offering strange fire before the Lord. Holiness is an abstract concept, so we have an art project to help your children wrap their minds around it. The student's instructed to make 2 lists of words, one describing God's holiness and one describing mankind's sinfulness. He's told to try to come up with at least 10 words in each list. Here's some sample ideas. God's holiness is perfect, set apart, pure, righteous, awesome, true, just, flawless, or beautiful. Mankind's sinfulness would be wretched, rebellious, flawed, wicked, self-seeking, selfish, unlawful, corrupted, condemned. After making the list, he's supposed to think about how to illustrate this stark contrast visually. God's holiness might be illustrated with strips of shiny aluminum foil, for example, while mankind's sinfulness could be a pile of used coffee grounds. The goal of the exercise is not to win an art award, but to form a deeper understanding of sin and holiness through artistic expression. In addition to their art projects, older children will read through the book of Leviticus this week. Leviticus 1 through 5 contains detailed descriptions of various types of sacrifices. Leviticus 6 through 7 describes what the priests do when they perform these sacrifices, while Leviticus 8 spells out how the priests are to be ordained. This book describes how the whole priestly system began, as well as how it was to be run. That's why Leviticus 9 describes the ordination of Aaron and his sons in such detail. God sent fire down to consecrate his altar. Yet the very next chapter, Leviticus 10, tells the tragedy of Nadab and Abihu. On the very day that Aaron and his 4 sons began to minister, 2 of them were struck down for their presumption. Leviticus 11 through 15 provides specific laws about cleanliness and purity. They include the kosher laws, which tell which animals should or should not be eaten, but they also go into detail about diseases, bodily discharges, mildew, and the like. Leviticus 16 spells out the rituals for the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. God starts by referring back to Nadab and Abihu's sin, and he warns Aaron not to come into the most holy place at any time, lest he die. Observe here the gravity of worshiping a holy God. This is God's tabernacle, not Aaron's. Leviticus 17 through 25 provide more laws of behavior, rules for priests, festivals. These chapters include more case law, which applies God's principles to specific situations. Leviticus 26 spells out punishments for breaking God's laws. The ultimate punishment for violating God's laws was exile, to be driven out of the promised land. But the book doesn't end there. God promises to restore his people if they will just confess their sins. Leviticus 26, 40 through 45 says, "But if they confess their iniquity, and the iniquity of their fathers and their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. When they are in the land of their enemies, I will not spurn them, neither will I abhor them so as to destroy them utterly and break my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God. But I will for their sake remember the covenant with their forefathers, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their God. I am the Lord." Leviticus 27, the last chapter of the book, lists the price of redemption for men, women, children, slaves, and property. After God's great promise to remember his covenant in chapter 26, it seems a little odd to end with this exercise in accounting. To a Christian, though, this last chapter of Leviticus means something special. Chapter 26 tells us to confess our sins and promises that God remembers his covenant, but chapter 27 reminds us that God has paid the price of redemption for each of us, men and women, children, rich and poor, slave and free. So, how can sinful people enter the presence of a holy God? They must worship him as he chooses, not as they do. They must confess and seek atonement for their sins. God provided a whole system of animal sacrifices for his people in Old Testament times, but ultimately it takes more than a goat to take away our sins. We need a Redeemer who can pay the price to restore us.